How do we overcome that people-pleasing perspective, that overachiever mentality, so that it doesn't consume us in a negative way, but we're still driven to serve at a high level?
Yeah, so acknowledging it, I think, is the most important aspect of the beginning stages of the journey. So the fact that I'm able to say here
that you
that
are
I
this.
have
Yeah,
that,
you have this,
that
yeah.
I have that filter, as I call it, that's painting everything that happens in my life, that's the first step of healing. Because I, like many of us, wasn't aware of that filter, and it was coloring my experience, and so I would take any moment and end up feeling badly and not understanding why. And until I began to view my internal world, I began to see the stories I was creating. So that moment in particular, whatever it might be, was yet another, moment for me to have evidence that I'm not living up to that expectation. So pulling back and, seeing that lens, oh, okay, here's that tendency to compare myself down again, that at least gives me the opportunity to create a new choice, which brings us to the next stage and why my book is called The Work. Because listeners, and myself included, many of us could resonate with this. Yes, I'm an overachiever. I have that part in my mind, yet now what? That part is still there coloring our experiences. So then it is the work of refocusing my attention, paying less focus, because that's our most powerful tool for many of us to begin, not spending time spinning down that framework, spinning down that story, ending up feeling so terrible about myself. Pulling my attentional focus away and putting it elsewhere is the best thing we can do for ourselves to begin, of course, the journey of unpacking and unlearning those deep beliefs.
Do you think a depressive state comes from an obsessive thought process? Is that what I'm hearing it comes from? Like the more you think and ruminate on, I'm not enough, I'll never have this, I suck, I'm not worthy, I'm not deserving, the more I ruminate on it for longer and longer, is that what's going to put me in that state of being?
It's one of the factors. It's not the only, and because I would come up against this idea of, and I think a lot of times in the field, it's criticized, think a different thought. Okay, I can just reframe just to use it very generally, my negative thinking, and begin to think more positive. And then if anyone is suffering from depression or those symptoms, I obviously can relieve those and feel better about myself. The issue with depression and anxiety and a lot of the things that we're diagnosed with, myself included, is that they're messengers of something deeper. So typically with depression, there might and likely is something physiological also at play. There could be some gut issues that are causing inflammation, that is causing actual inflammation in the brain and causing those symptoms of depression. There might be some nervous system activation, getting stuck in our parasympathetic, in particular nervous system, that results in that hypo-energetic arousal when I have no energy, I have no interest. So typically it's thoughts and the physiology that then maps on to thinking those thoughts for a very long time. Though my point of working holistically is to acknowledge the whole story, because I'm sure even a lot of listeners right now might have tried an affirmation, tried to think a positive thought and not actually been able to create change, because likely they are again living in a state of physiological dysregulation.
Right. So you might be able to change your thought, but if you're having alcohol at the same time, or if you're eating candy and processed foods all day and you're in a stressful environment physically, then it may not also shift your feelings or your emotions, right? It's kind of like you have to have a holistic approach to what is the root, what's causing me to feel this overwhelmed stress or depression, right?
Yeah, and it's beautiful that you're using the word stress, and very astute, because stress is insidious in our culture, and it causes not only psychological, but a whole range of physical health symptoms and ultimately diagnoses. Stress is really problematic, and unfortunately many of us as even adults are experiencing increasing amounts of stress, and in my opinion having very limited coping tools or resources to deal with that stress. So our bodies are really simply very much stuck in an overstressed, overwhelmed state that's again making change and transformation incredibly difficult.
What are the best coping strategies for humans to help us get out of stress and into more peaceful, calm states that you've seen?
The best ones?
The best coping strategies.
Yeah.
Not like the bad ones, but what are the good ones?
Yeah, we have the access to the most powerful regulator of stress through our breath. If we can learn two things, First, to be just present to or a witness around our body's just regular breathing patterns. As simple as this sounds, the way our body breathes, if we can cultivate a very full, deep breath, very calming breath, chances are our body in that moment is in that state of relaxation, is receptive to the world around, is feeling safe to express. The large majority of us aren't breathing in that very calm, rhythmic way. Most of us have evolved to become chest-based, very shallow breathers. And the reason why I even just talk about our natural rhythm is because our mind is constantly scanning our body and its processes. Yeah. Breathing in particular, because for our mind, that's a marker of how aroused we are, how stressed our body is. So what I noticed when I dropped into my body was that I always breathed very shallow from my chest, and at times I would stop breathing. And that correlated with stress. The more stressed I am, the more I'm actually holding my breath throughout the day. So just that simple act of witnessing to me showed evidence of, wow, Nicole, your body is stressed out day in and day out, regardless of what's happening in the actual current moment. Your body continues to send signals of stress. And the reason why listeners who might struggle with anxiety or panic, as I once did, why this is problematic is because, like I said, our mind is scanning down, and it's going to begin to then think stressful thoughts. It's going to scan the environment for what's wrong. And as we all know, we're very good at identifying what's wrong
negative, yes.
in that moment. And then before we know it, the reason why I offer this is now we're caught in a loop. Because now I'm thinking stressful thoughts, further activating my body. So dropping in, noticing our body's natural rhythms can give us some clues as to how activated we are. And then, of course, the next action step we can take, if you're living in an overactivated nervous system as I am, is to begin to harness intentional breathing, beginning to either direct my breath down into my belly if I am in that shallow, stressed out, activated state, or if you're, like I described earlier, having no energy, almost feel like you're not here energetically, we actually want to cultivate that chest base, the more Wim Hof, shallow, activated tool of breath work to activate our nervous system, to actually up our energy into our system. So we can use breath work in either direction to control our body's responses. And while this is great for the body, and why I talk about it is it can build body balance back in, as many of us need it, it's also so empowering. Now, right, through an intention, through doing something differently, I can actually create change. And I speak as someone who did suffer from debilitating anxiety and panic attacks, and I know how overwhelming and out of control that can feel. So I mentioned that last piece of empowerment for all of those suffering with anxiety out there, because that can be the steps back to actually creating change and saying, hey, wait, I can control my body, and my body doesn't have to control me when it hits that peak of panic.
What is happening when someone is in a panic attack? Like, what were the feelings like? How long did it last? And how does someone get out of a panic attack moment?
So panic, and again, I'm just simplifying it for understanding purposes, it's that ultimate state of nervous system activation when your body is literally geared up to fight, flight, or flee, which is usually what happens next. We go into that old coping tool or that old resource that we once used. It feels very different for each of us. Some of us actually think it can feel, as I once did, like a heart attack.
Wow.
I describe an episode in my book where I had just gotten home. I was in a psychoanalytic training program, and as part of my training, every Saturday I would sit in courses to learn how to be a practitioner of the work of psychoanalysis, and one of my courses was a group model where I was a participant in group psychoanalytic therapy. So anyone listening who's been in any therapy, a lot of feelings can come up. So it was a particularly emotional group I had had that morning. And I came home and I was with my partner at the time, and long story short, I started to have symptoms. I started to feel sweaty. I started to feel clammy. I almost turned gray looking. And my heart in particular started to beat problematically or of concern. It was pounding. It just felt weird. And I'm someone who had panic attacks before. I know a panic attack can mimic a heart attack, yet I was in my down puffy coat, curled up in a ball with my cell phone in my hands, just waiting to call 911 because I was convinced that this must be something that's physiologically wrong with me. So some of us, it can feel like a heart attack. Some of us, it's just that elevation where my heart feels like it's through the roof. I might get that panicked feeling like I'm crawling out of my skin. And it's very, very scary. And what it is, again, it's an extreme state of that nervous system activation. So the best tool is to help our nervous system go back into that peaceful, calm, safe place. Now, this is where I want to acknowledge that those of us who are in the throes of a panic attack and have never practiced intentional breathing or breath work probably aren't going to be successful. And this is, of course, what we want to do. We want to use the tool only when we need it. This is where we really want to learn how to cultivate that balance in our bodies outside of that 10 moment, outside of that acute where panic is crashing down around me.
Right.
We want to consistently learn how to drop into our bodies, take a temperature check. How safe is my body? Am I in activation mode or am I calm? And when I'm not calm, learning how to balance my body then, so that when, as I feel my panic obviously increasing over time, I can learn how to downregulate myself.
Is the panic attacks, what's the root of that? Is it someone not being aware of their body and breathing? Is it allowing stressful thoughts to come in? Is it all of it stacking up over time and then there's a breaking point? What is the root of panic attacks?
It becomes all of it over time because our nervous system works outside of our awareness. We have a function, it's called neuroception. It's essentially where we're constantly scanning the environment, energies even included.
We're not even aware of it.
We're not even
our body,
aware
our,
of it.
our eyes, everything
and it's
is
primed to look for threat. However, threat gets defined based on our past experiences. This is how we can't kind of extricate the two. So something that felt overwhelming back here continues to color my world in my now moment.
Even if it's not really happening.
Outside of my awareness, right? So that's really important to consider. That's the feeling that many of us get when we maybe walk into the room or up that alley and just something feels off. We're responding, our nervous system is always responding to everything in the moment. However, it's doing so based on our past moments. So we could be throwing ourselves, unbeknownst to ourselves, into nervous system activation. And some of us are living in it all day long.
Crazy. When we feel stressed, is it affecting the actual brain or is it affecting the mind? And how do we regulate the two? Of the thoughts, the ideas, the mind, the consciousness, I guess, the awareness, or the brain, the physical brain itself? Yeah. What is stress? Going up into the brain, or is it actually attacking the mind, kind of like outside of the brain?
It can affect both. It affects the brain structure in two ways. The first way is through actual inflammation.
Okay.
Stress, the cortisol that typically is associated with stress, activates our body, activates immune system responses, where inflammation is the predominant response. Our brain is actually covered by a very thin film, a blood-brain barrier that's very penetrable. Things can get through. And one of the issues is when inflammation actually lands within our brain. So that can begin to cause structural changes in our brain, as can our mind. The way we think, the way we process our brain can actually change the brain pathways, the systems, areas that we're firing up more frequently than other areas, with the most predominant one. So many of us are living from our emotional brain, our amygdala, our hippocampus, all of those deeper centers, as opposed to our prefrontal cortex. So this is why it gets complicated. And there are very many brain scans out there of depressed individuals, of anxious individuals, of individuals diagnosed with ADHD or ADD, of autistic, right? All of these diagnoses map onto the brain showing changes, though it's the chicken or the egg conversation, because those changes, my argument is, occur as a result of the human's functioning. I believe as far back as in utero, I know that my system was impacted by my mom, by the hormones raging through her body, because I was sharing that body. I was sharing a blood source. I go as far to believe my mom's beliefs, her thoughts about herself, about me as a baby in her belly, about what my future would be, were impacting, again, my developing. So our environments, I believe, begin to shape us. So hypothetically, I could have came out as a baby infant showing, like I likely did, structural changes in my brain, possibly even an upregulated nervous system. hard to differentiate whether genetically that's just what it was for me, or again, whether my earliest environment shaped. And I believe in the science of epigenetics, that our environments are always shaping ourselves down to our physiology.
Our genetics. Our environment is shaping our DNA.
It's shaping our DNA, and then shaping our systems, shaping how our brain looks and functions, shaping how our body looks and functions.
Yeah. Well, what's that study where they put like love and anger on water bottles? Did you ever see that? I can't remember.
The ice, yes.
Yeah, the ice, and then it's either like dark crystals, like dead crystal, you know, or it's like these beautiful snowflakes. I can't remember what that study was, or that test.
Where they did the frequency of different emotions.
Yes.
And had then ice that would freeze, I guess, ultimately, and it would crystallize in different structural. And it's beautiful because what I see is that shows evidence of how impactful the things that we can't see are. And I think the collective is waking up to the reality that there are a lot of these things that we can't see. There are energies, there are inner knowings, there are messages of all sorts that, again, we're responding to outside of our awareness, that are there, even though we can't see them or the science isn't showing it in the graph that fits very comfortably into our human mind.
Right.
Anytime we're in that expansive unknown, it's very uncomfortable for us as humans.
It's like we can't see our thoughts, but those thoughts will impact us, right? Will impact our structure of our brain, our body, how we feel when we think a certain thing as well in the environment. You mentioned people-pleasing overachiever kind of archetype, right? What are the different types of archetypes that human beings have? Is one people-pleaser, overachiever? What are the main ones, I guess?
Yeah, so just an archetype, so everyone knows what we're talking about here. Again, it's a very conditioned, patterned way of being. We don't, as humans, typically fall neatly. Some of us might see ourselves in only one archetype. Some of us might see evidence in different archetypes. We might see different sides of ourselves in different types of relationships. So multiple archetypes might apply. Again, they're not, be-all, end-all categories, but they're general ways of being. Typically, how we're relating to others in relationships or to the world at large. So I mentioned the overachiever because that's one of my predominant ones. Some others are the caretaker, the person who's always endlessly showing up to service others' needs.
But never their own.
Never their own. The yes person who can't say no, who's always, again, in another model of service. There's a hero worshiper archetype, always outsourcing, always looking for the person or the thing that has an answers as opposed to within. Life of the party, another archetype that's pretty common. The person who never allows any negative, if you will, even though I don't love those words, sadness, any lower kind of vibration energy to be part of their experience. They're always happy. Everything's always great. Again, acknowledging that there's a range of human emotion, and if we're cutting off, the negative, we're usually cutting off aspects of our lived experience. So they're general ways of being. Typically, maybe listeners can know kind of the way they show up in relationships. If not, being a witness, seeing how are you showing up? What is your primary mode of relating to other people? This is based in the idea that typically our primary modes of relating are based on our earliest relationships. We get very repetitive. So I was, like I described, my overachievement didn't start in adulthood. I began to assume that role in my childhood relationships, the person who's always performing in one way or another, or trying to keep the peace in one way or another.
That was me. Keeping the peace was me, for sure. And so if we are aware of that first, kind of our main archetypes, is the next step learning how to heal, or is it learning how to reparent, or what would be the next phase that we should in doing the work?
So the first, as I always acknowledge, for some of us, just having that awareness.
Yeah, it's huge.
I'm continuing to have my needs unmet in relationships because that's usually the byproduct of assuming roles or wearing these masks, is my full self isn't being expressed, or I'm chronically not acknowledging any of my needs. For some of us, acknowledging that role and typically where it came from, though that's not mandatory. You don't need to know the thing that hurt me. But for some of us, that can be relieving. That can offer an alternate version of narration as opposed to I'm broken, which is usually where we end up. Oh, I'm unfulfilled in my relationships because I'm unlovable, because something's wrong with me. So for some of us, just having that awareness, no, I'm the overachiever, or I'm the caretaker because of things that have happened as a result of my experiences. For some of us, that's healing in and of itself.
Is these coping mechanisms then?
Typically.
These kind of master archetypes.
Yes.
It's like we do this because...
Our way of being becomes, I call it the onion. By the time we're in adulthood, we're living such a conditioned way, typically as a result of coping with something that was too overwhelming or too difficult at one time.
And the coping, is it all back to feeling seen, heard, and acknowledged? Is it like we do these things so that someone sees us or acknowledges us?
In my opinion. Yeah. And or to then, as a byproduct, avoid the pain that once was. Right? If showing, right, so the life of the party, I'll use as an example. If at one point when I showed sadness, it didn't feel accepted given whatever has happened, right? Then if I stop, if I modify, if I do not tell mom the sad thing that happened, I don't have to feel that pain of that rejection. So I just say a little less of my sadness and a little less of my sadness over time. So it's a coping to avoid that hurt that was once unbearable.
It's to either be seen or to avoid pain.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah.
So how should we, what archetype should we live in?
So once we become aware, right, if the relief can go so far for some of us, then we're still left with us and our conditioned way of being.
Right.
We're still left with that habit, that pull. Like I shared throughout my book even, my overachiever is right there, ready, right, for that reaction in each and every moment. So cultivating new responses is ultimately the next step. Responses that we now get to choose. As an adult. At one point, we weren't gifted with choice. We were in environments that we had no say around. Now, I can show up, I can make a new choice, so I can learn a new way of being. I can begin to show maybe all aspects of myself, walking through the discomfort that will come along with change and the vulnerability that's part of the process now of showing a new part of myself, though over time, that allows me to cultivate my full self-expression. So the work, as my book offers, is still part of the journey.
Yeah.
Awareness isn't going to create change because those habits are mapped down into our subconscious pathways that are at the ready. We've gotten really good at firing them up, and our brain actually prefers that path. So showing up in our conscious mind, teaching ourselves that we always have that pathway that leads to all of the consequences that they've always led to. And then this pathway could lead to something else that will probably be uncomfortable because it's new, it's uncharted territory, though it could help me march toward a future of my choosing.
How does someone learn to reparent themselves if their parents are no longer here? Like, how do they even go down that path, which might seem just a little weird? It's like, am I supposed to reparent myself? That sounds weird. What is a non-weird way to approach that? And is that us connecting to our 5-year-old self, or whenever that situation first started, that was painful, and having a conversation and actually connecting to that child? Is it a daily practice of connecting to something on the inside? What does that look like?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I will acknowledge too that I think anytime we hear this idea of child and we're an adult, I mean, some of us into years into adulthood, it does feel uncomfortable. It does feel like, what do you mean? I'm out of childhood. I don't have that aspect of myself. I'm an adult now. I'm of the belief that our inner child is carried with us in many different ways. And we could start with maybe the least scary, through our daily habits and patterns. Typically, you're caring for your body, I imagine, unless you made an intentional shift at somewhere in your adult life, the same way you were taught to. How our physical needs are identified and met in adulthood typically is a reflection of how they were once met in childhood, how attuned our caregivers were to their own physical needs, obviously then transferring that into our own attunement with our bodies, identifying what our individual needs are so that over time we can assume that responsibility of meeting them ourselves. I'm of the belief that all of us were raised by humans that are limited by the tools that they had. So I'll be the first to admit, I know that I was raised by 2 parent figures that didn't really have a full connection to their body and to its physical needs. So again, when they were parenting me or cultivating that awareness in me, it was from that much more limited consciousness state or that disconnection. So not surprising, I ended up being very disconnected from my own body's needs. Now this applies to our emotional world too. Chances are the habits and patterns, the way we tend to our emotions in adulthood, is a direct reflection of how we tended or how we were modeled or what coping tools were even available to us at one time in one place. So to do the work of reparenting, we could just see ourselves, witness ourselves in adulthood, see the areas where we are feeling like we show up for our needs. Do we acknowledge physical needs in our daily life? Acknowledging that our body has them day in and day out. Or are we so disconnected that we don't even know what they are? Same thing emotionally. Right. What is our emotional climate? How do we navigate emotions when we have them? And again, can we begin to create new habits? So that's what reparenting, the approachable version is. Sure. Can I create new habits and patterns in any of these areas, physical, emotional, or spiritual, that better serve me? Again, acknowledging that we're limited by that which was taught to us or modeled for us, acknowledging the limitations of our caregivers.
You know, we all have these toxic patterns. Well, no one's immune. We all, and the signals of those are things like depression and anxiety, and those are simply telling you, hey, there's a pattern. That pattern is actually putting your body under tremendous stress, even to the point where your DNA is affected. And I showed in my research that